Welcome to episode number 51, Adult Onset Mental Illness. I am your host, Damon Soka. Today we are going to talk about mental illness that occurs later in life, after the formal development of the body has already occurred. Now, when I talk about adult onset mental illness, I'm going to be referring to mental illness that starts during or after one's 20s. Now, depending upon where you get your statistics, the odds state that any one person would have about a 20 to 25% chance of having at least one case of adult onset mental illness in their life. And now that statistic encompasses all mental illness, but most of those cases fall into the depression and anxiety categories, with anxiety by far the most common. Now you have to be careful even about that statistic, as it measures all severities of the illness and the types that come and go, as well as those that stick around for a lifetime. Not all cases of those statistics are going to need therapy and treatment, and it is not uncommon for someone to have more than one of the many subsets of mental illness at one time, such as depression along with a general anxiety disorder. It is important to note also that not everyone has the same susceptibility to the illness, so the odds greatly differ from person to person. Genetics, trauma, and a variety of internal and external stimuli combine to determine the individual's true vulnerability to the illness. And what is important to note about all the statistics is that adult onset mental illness is probably one of the most common illnesses, and within any given year is by far one of the most common illnesses that occur in the world. Yet it is almost troubling that it seems to be rarely discussed in public and especially in private. Now, one might think that I might not have much to say about this particular type of the illness or brand of the illness. After all, my own illness was more early onset in the adolescent variety. Now, while it is true that my own particular form of the illness was bipolar, and more oriented to my two previous podcasts about childhood anxiety and teenage mental illness, I did suffer as an adult into my 30s. I do have a reasonable understanding of what mental illness navigation is like when you're swimming through the shark-infested waters of adult mental illness. Certainly, there's going to be a difference in that most adults who deal with the illness have not experienced mental illness during the formative years of development, meaning that for the most part, they were likely to have had a fairly normal childhood and teenage experiences, if there really is such a thing. I suppose that I use the word normal in the sense that they did not have added difficulties of mental illness. I'm not insinuating that they had childhoods free from trauma or other environmental causes of the illness. What I really am saying is that they reached a level of maturity without experiencing the more crippling symptoms and developmental problems previously discussed. The more I talk to people about those normal years, the more I understand how abnormal most of those years were for them, even when they didn't experience mental illness. Sometimes I even wonder if the illness I experienced during those years, which has erased most of my memories, might be more of a gift than I had previously thought. Now, I have discussed mental illness from a couple of different perspectives, and I think it's probably important to delineate these right now, these differing perspectives, as I talk about this illness as an adult. Now, my first perspective that I often talk about is chemistry, or really purely genetics. There is at least some good data showing that somewhere in our genetics as human beings, we possess the ability to pass on mental illness. Now, this is especially true with depression and bipolar and even anxiety, but I would suspect that it's probably true for almost all mental illness in some form. However, the actual genetic structure that does this is really still under investigation. I would suspect that some of this stems from the fact that we still don't know a lot about the brain and how it works. We do know a great deal about the complexity of the gray matter above our shoulders, but all we really know is it's mind-boggling. My personal opinion is that it's probably going to be fairly difficult to determine what's really going on until we pass to the other side of the veil and understand both the interaction of the physical body with the spiritual body. And for now, there really isn't any good way of observing that and how that interaction works. But we do know that genetics are an important factor when discussing mental illness, and even adult onset mental illness. The second perspective is more about environmental causes, such as trauma. Now, trauma extends to a rather large field of environmental events, including what we would normally see as trauma, such as accidents or abuse, but also included in this large world are things such as heart attacks, strokes, head injuries, repeated head injuries, such as you find in sports, diseases that affect the chemistry of the body, and really anything that can cause trouble in the brain. As I stated, that's a large field. What is important is that one keeps an open mind when discussing what and what is not trauma and what does not affect mental illness. As I have stated previously, even trauma cannot explain mental illness entirely, because there are many people who have experienced identical traumas, and yet they do not always experience mental illness. And so there exists a third, probably more logical option when it comes to these two perspectives. The third option is a combination of both trauma and genetic predisposition to mental illness. Although I will not rule out that trauma in and of itself could also be the cause. While the cause is important to diagnosis and treatment of the mental illness, especially if the trauma is something of the nature of PTSD or truly chemistry related, such as thyroid disease, it really doesn't necessarily change the experience of depression, the symptoms and the problems that depression and anxiety can bring into one's life as an adult. Now, I think that my best example of this would be my own wife and myself. She experienced postpartum depression after our 7th child. The depression has never subsided, although she has done her best to work with both the doctors and, of course, the Lord. My depressions and anxieties stem from my early onset of bipolar disorder and my current problems with my autoimmune illnesses and the resulting disabilities associated with that disease. The foundations of our mental illnesses are quite different, and her illness was adult onset and caused by hormonal concerns and likely a predisposition where mine could be more associated with childhood and genetics. We are both obviously of the opposite sex, yet we seem to experience in many ways very similar symptoms when it comes to our depression issues. Now, I will admit that my depression does appear to be far more mild than hers, but even then, the experiences for her only seem to go deeper, not really differ. Both of us have anxiety concerns, which we deal with quite differently. But as near as I can tell, the feelings are quite similar. So while there might be significant differences in the cause, I firmly believe that we probably experience very similar emotional distortions when we experience mental illness. There is probably one thing that she does experience that I generally do not. She grew up without any noticeable depression issues, except for some mild depression issues as a teenager, having a relatively normal childhood, and even into her adult years, bearing children. So the one thing I believe that she experiences, that I may not as much, is the disorienting nature of adult onset mental illness. I grew up with illness, and really, I have not known life without it in some way. Yet she has known life without it. And for someone who is an adult, this can be terribly confusing, frustrating, disorienting, and really a disheartening experience to feel mental illness later in life. My wife knew life without the illness and can compare her life to what it was previously. I really cannot. Now, I could see how this could be very difficult. I learned coping mechanisms early in my youth and grew to accommodate the illness. She did not have this advantage, and so she has had to learn these coping mechanisms when they are much more difficult to learn and internalize. I don't have the statistics, but I would think that having a later onset of the illness would prove to be more difficult than an early onset. However, it is really difficult to say. But what I can say is that for a time, the Lord did allow me some relief of my illness, in that I was able to feel some normal emotional states. And then I returned to my issues with a more mild depression rather than my full-blown bipolar. For me, I still had coping mechanisms embedded from my previous experiences, but I could see from that experience how not having them would bring a far greater misery into one's life. Now, when I talk about a later onset of mental illness, one might think that a traumatic experience has brought upon the illness. Something had to happen for it to occur. Childbirth probably has some trauma associated with it, but I believe that most of the science believes it has more to do with hormonal imbalances and changes. But even then, they really don't know. Things such as a stroke, heart attack, changes in hormones due to cancer or disease might make more sense than one day realizing that you don't feel the same way you once did about anything in this world. However, whether you can pinpoint a cause or not, the feelings are there, and knowing the cause doesn't necessarily lessen the experience or make you feel good about your depression or anxiety. Now, I don't like the word random, but if you look at a variety of mental illnesses, the symptoms, timing, and a host of other things in one's life, including simply aging, sometimes mental illness can simply appear randomly. Now, I know that the Lord has all things under his control, so random is really a worldly perspective of it. But still, I know a father close to me who denied mental illness for quite a while, really thinking that perhaps it was just someone who didn't yet have control of their emotions in some way. Now, surprisingly or not, this view is not uncommon, especially for people of his age. However, despite his unbelief, he began to experience what are called panic attacks, which is a form of anxiety disorder. His words to me are now very different. I didn't understand it before, but I do now. I have no control when it strikes me. I have to get out, and nothing in this world is going to stop me. So even unbelief is not something that can contain a mental illness. Adult onset mental illness comes about in a variety of ways and times in one's life. It can be late in the 20s or 30s or 40s or 50s or even when one has retired. There is no point at which you grow beyond it. Certainly there are instances where mental illness is purely environmental in the sense that if you remove the environmental cause, the illness does have a tendency to go away. For instance, some individuals have a seasonal disorder that when they move away from gray and cloudy areas to more sunny skies, things improve. Moving on from a job where you really don't like what you're doing to something more stimulating. Finding purpose after retirement. And of course, a host of other external factors. Because of this, many individuals look for external causes to their issues. Even when you find what is often referred to as a midlife crisis. However, just because some mental illness, depression or anxiety is purely environmental, does not mean that all cases are. I guess that is the trouble with a later onset of the illness. We as adults have a tendency to focus on environmental issues rather than thinking that the issue may not be entirely outside pressures. People become frustrated and begin a process of demoralizing self-improvement that never seems to work. I'm not saying that self-improvement is bad. That is actually one of the messages of the gospel. One should not try to isolate the external causes. One should not try to isolate the external causes if they exist. What I am saying is that focusing solely on external causes might make one miss more internal causes and lead down a path that is not likely to end well. Far too often I have seen these individuals jump from one cause to another and from one self-help guru to a better self-help guru, only to find that it only works for a short time frame. What we often find is that many people turn to external means to rectify the internal issues that may be, again, more internal than external. Self-medication is one of those major problems associated with adult onset mental illness. Of course, that is true for the others as well. It is not difficult to understand that when you find something that makes you feel alive again, that you might want to chase it. Unfortunately, often that which makes them feel alive is also that which leads them down some dead-end roads. Drugs, prescription or otherwise, alcohol, sexual drive, pornography and promiscuity, adultery, risky behavior, jumping out of airplanes, riding wild bulls, buying fast cars and motorcycles. They all have at least one thing in common. They are drugs of various nature. Whether the drug is adrenaline from risky pursuits or painkillers or alcohol or perhaps even the sexual drive in nature, it generally ends pretty much the same. Short-lived drug addictions are never going to satisfy the mental illness, and they are going to cause behavior modification and the need for more and more risky behavior to satisfy the problem. Now you might say, well, not everyone who experiences a later onset of the illness quickly jumps to risky behavior. That is, of course, very true. But other behaviors, such as isolation, retracting from society, and abandoning long-held religious beliefs, is its own form of, let's say, torture and behavior modification that can actually lead to almost the same end as the more risky behavior. Thoughts of suicide come more easily when you have isolated yourself to the point that you believe no one cares and that you no longer provide any value to family, social groups, friends, neighbors, or even a ward family. I realize that the behavior modification is simply an attempt to run away from the illness and the darkness that ensues, and I do understand it because I have felt it deeply at times. But I have found that the only way through it is to turn and face it rather than to run from it and really truly understand that you need help. A later onset of the illness provides for its very own unique set of problems, and yet the treatments remain very much the same, and strangely so do the symptoms. Now, while symptoms often differ individually in adults who find themselves suffering, it is not so much the specific symptoms that one needs to watch for, but behavior modification. People who no longer find happiness or passion in the same things. Friends who once visited frequently no longer appear at the door. Family who are far more angry, sullen, retracted, and isolated. The common sign that seems to be true in almost every case is found in the question we often ask people, "Are you okay?" If you are close to someone, we begin to notice small things about their changes in them, and when they begin to descend into this depression or anxiety, they will seem different to us, often more emotional in a variety of small ways, or even less emotional if they're trying to control it. If you ask the question if they're okay, which really means, are they feeling different, or I'm really perceiving something troubling in you, and their answer is vague, then you likely have some type of issue occurring. When my wife first experienced postpartum depression, I would often ask if she was feeling okay or if there was something wrong. She would always respond, "I don't know." I could tell from the outside that there was something different about her on the inside. Those small things, such as changes in patterns of smiling, desires to accomplish something, passion for things she loved. Now, it is easy to pass this off as some kind of, at least in this case, hormonal imbalance or adjustment in women, or in men, maybe even a midlife crisis. But after the childbearing has, or even after the childbearing has ended, but if the questions remain the same, and so do the answers, then it is time to get help. This is especially true when they don't know what is wrong, but they can tell something might be wrong. Now, my wife resisted at first when I began to say that she might have depression, and I actually had to make the appointment for her. Yes, she was prescribed medication, but within a few days to a couple of weeks, her comments startled me a little. And now this is from someone who had experienced pretty severe mental illness most of their life. She said to me that she did not know how far she had drifted and how bad the depression was. That is the true problem with mental illness. Self-diagnosis is nearly impossible as the illness changes our reality. I've talked about that regularly. This idea that the person is often unable to see the forest through the trees type of behavior is very, very common in adult onset illness. More often than not, someone close will have to make an initial diagnosis, saying, "I think you might have depression or anxiety." type of diagnosis before the person actually gets help. And that includes also sometimes you're going to need to help them get help. Now, sometimes, like this father I know, the illness might be of the nature that it's quite obvious. Panic attacks are far more sudden and they don't come on slowly and change reality. And they're probably far more noticeable to the person experiencing them. But the answer is generally the same. Those who love them need to be cognizant of the changes, both small and large, in emotional states and behaviors. Now, we do realize that our bodies change over time. You can talk about reduction in testosterone and other hormones, reduction in metabolism, all sorts of chemistry changes in the body and in mind. And this can bring upon the person a temporary or even a more permanent change in mental and emotional stability. Now, what I'm trying to say in all of this, probably far too many words, is that the mental illness can happen to anyone at any time in their life. There doesn't need to be some type of cascading event to trigger the illness. Sure, there are things like childbirth, sunlight, head injuries, and various other diseases and sources that can be triggers, and they are easier to point to as causes, but in some cases, in fact, many cases, depression or anxiety just shows up at your doorstep. The point is, one cannot ever really dismiss the idea that it could happen to you. Now, for some people, that is just absolutely scary. And yet, for others, it might be comforting, especially if they've experienced it. I know that we want our world to make sense, and thinking that a mental illness might just come upon you without some type of trigger event seems to be beyond our reason. I will admit, for the most part, there will be something that probably can be pointed out to, even if it is not the trigger for the mental illness. Now, I myself have blamed a host of outside evidences that I believe triggered my illness, which in retrospect probably did not. They may have worsened it, but I doubt that they actually triggered it. Most often for me, this took the form of sin as I tried to look for these trigger evidences. As the reality of depression, of the illness depression, and anxiety often mimics sin in various ways. My sins were never that grievous, but it did not matter to my rational mind. I needed a cause and effect type of trigger, and sin, even small sin, worked to justify the depressed feelings. I have no doubt this is true for many members of the church, and why so often they drift from church practices. Being a member of the church and consistently talking about feelings, promptings, love, charity, the idea that wickedness never was happiness, or if you're unhappy, you're probably wicked, can quickly become the go-to method of diagnosis and eventually consume one's whole life. There is a tendency when one feels depression and anxiety and then associates sin with the cause to attempt to do more, be more, love more, and serve more, somehow making up for that sin that doesn't exist really, or the lost time. The attempt is to dissuade the feelings by doing more that would invite a better spirit into our lives, feeling somehow that we have, I guess, invited an evil one. I have been there far too many times to count, and I can say without reserve that depression cannot be dissuaded by good works or good intentions. Yes, sometimes we feel a little better, but the depression always returns. However, depression can worsen when one works the body and mind to exhaustion. I'm not saying that someone who is depressed should never do good things. That isn't the point. Doing good things while depressed in a measured way can actually help, but it is rare that someone can remain measured during a depression. More often than not, we do too much. Now, I admit that the pressure of the gospel in a fallen world can be difficult and even stressful. Sometimes this leads to the thinking that removing oneself from these pressures will give the mind and body time to rest. You don't have to worry about those things that you should be doing, saying, and giving when your body can only simply take care of itself. I admit that social pressures can be daunting, and removing oneself from those social pressures can help at times, but removing oneself from the gospel is really never an answer. I advocate generally for doing what you can and understanding that you have limitations with your mental illness that others may not even understand. This does not mean that I'm saying you can go self-medicate with illicit drugs or alcohol or the variety of self-medications that I've already discussed, or even walk away from the commandments that keep us safe. What I am saying is that an email to your ministering families might be sufficient rather than an actual visit. Going to sacrament rather than both hours of church might be enough for the Lord. Doing what you can, when you can, pushing yourself enough, but perhaps not too much. That is going to be a tough balance for someone whose mental world and perspective has changed. But it is critical that even during episodes of depression or anxiety, we remain engaged as much as possible with the Lord and His commandments, and even His people. Sometimes this might not be very much engagement at all, but the Lord understands, and His grace is always sufficient when He has provided the trial. What we need to remember is simply to turn to the Lord, ask for help, and avoid the temptation to define the help that you need and expect from the Lord. The Lord knows what you need, and while you might request certain objectives, remember that it is far better for the Lord to decide what is needed than us. He sees that eternal perspective that is impossible during our anxiety or attack or bout of depression, or even both. He knows what will be best for us in the moment and in the time, and what will not. Now, I've had times when He has removed the effects of my illness for a period of time to allow for rest and recovery. I've had times when nothing was removed, but the Lord decided to provide strength to overcome. Still other times, He has asked me to bear it as best I can and move forward. Each has had its purpose and design. That doesn't mean that I didn't ask, beg, and even plead for removal of the illness. I have at times attempted to impose my will upon the Lord, hoping somehow that if I requested just right or just enough, or perhaps with enough emotion, He could see my side of things. Of course, we know that is not how the Lord works, but in the midst of the trial, it is rare that we see the value. In almost every case, we see the value once the trial has passed. I know how difficult mental illness is when there are children with wants and needs, households to be run, finances to be obtained, life to be lived, service to be rendered, and love to be given, and you really don't have anything to give to those many requirements in your life. Sometimes all we can give is the very minimal effort, and we never feel that it is enough. And sometimes our minimal effort feels lost in all of the needs, kind of more of a raindrop to an ocean type of a need sometimes. And our desire to give up looms like a dark, ominous cloud over the horizon. I can say without reserve, looking back, that the Lord never left me to myself, even when it felt very much like He did. When in the midst of the trial, I rarely saw His hand or His effort on my behalf. I felt alone, discouraged, disheartened, and overwhelmed with my responsibilities. There were at times when I wanted it all to end, and those were the times when all I could say was that I needed help, and then I would collapse into my bed. Somehow the help always came, whether I recognized it as help or not, and the trial passed. Now I hope with all my heart that you can simply say those words, that I need help, and then the Lord will work His miracles in your life. May He bless you with your illness. Until next week, keep up the fight, and the Lord will do His part.